She was nobody, a quiet assistant who filed papers and made coffee and kept her eyes down. Then one late night, she opened the wrong encrypted folder, and every assassin in Chicago got her name. The man who saved her wasn't a hero. He was the most dangerous criminal the city had ever produced. And now she belongs to his world whether she wants to or not. If this story grips you from the first second, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay until the very end. You will not see the final twist coming. The office tower was the kind of building that made ordinary people feel small on purpose. 42 floors of black glass and polished steel rising out of Chicago's near north side like a monument to everything money could buy and conscience could ignore. The lobby alone cost more to build than most people earned in a lifetime. White marble floors, recessed lighting that never flickered, security desks staffed around the clock by men with earpieces and flat, unreadable eyes. The Hargrove Meridian Corporation occupied floors 20 through 42, and it operated the way all truly powerful companies operated, visibly, loudly, and with one very careful hand always kept hidden. Maris Holloway had worked there for 4 years. She was 31 years old. Brown hair she kept pulled back because loose hair was one more thing to manage, and she had enough to manage already. She wore dark slacks and a gray blazer she'd owned since her second year on the job, and she had precisely the kind of face that people looked past in hallways without meaning to be rude about it. She had learned over years and through no small amount of quiet pain that invisibility was not always a disadvantage. Invisible people heard things. Invisible people were handed access to rooms and systems and filing structures that more prominent employees never got near because no one thought to worry about someone they never really saw. She was the executive assistant to Senior Vice President Gerald Thorne. Gerald was 54, silver-haired, and deeply committed to the performance of competence without the substance of it. He smiled in board meetings and delegated in private and had not drafted a single document with his own hands in at least 2 years. That was Maris's job. The drafting, the scheduling, the cross-referencing of shipping manifests and procurement invoices and interdepartmental logistics reports that came across her desk in waves so relentless she had long since stopped reading them as anything more than columns of numbers requiring organization. She had not planned to stay late on a Thursday in November. The building had mostly emptied by 7. The cleaning crews moved through in staggered rotations, the hum of industrial vacuums rising and fading through the walls like a tide going out. Maris sat at her workstation on the 31st floor with the city spread out behind her through the window, 10,000 lights burning in the dark, indifferent and magnificent. And she was trying to reconcile a discrepancy in a logistics invoice that had been flagging in the system for 3 days without anyone caring enough to fix it. A shipment number, a routing code, a freight carrier designation that did not match any of the carriers listed in the approved vendor database. It was the kind of thing that should have taken 20 minutes to resolve with a phone call to accounts receivable. But accounts receivable had gone home at 5. The vendor directory was locked behind a permissions wall she didn't normally have access to, and the only reason she had access tonight was because Gerald had handed her a temporary elevated clearance code 2 weeks ago to pull historical procurement records for a board presentation he ultimately decided he didn't need. He had forgotten to revoke the access. Maris did not think about that too hard. She input the code, navigated to the freight carrier archive, and started pulling records. The carrier designation, HMX Consolidated Freight, listed in the flagged invoice as a regular contractor, did not appear in the approved vendor list. It didn't appear in any vendor list. She ran a search across the full database. Nothing. She ran it against the shipping division's contractor registry. Nothing. She pulled the last 18 months of logistics records and ran a manual cross-reference. HMX Consolidated Freight appeared in 47 invoices totaling just under $12 million, all flagged with the same routing code, all signed off by the same internal authorization stamp, Gerald Thorne's stamp. She sat very still for a moment. The logical answer was a data entry error propagated across multiple records. A clerical mistake. A shadow vendor that had somehow slipped through compliance review. She had seen stranger things. She started pulling the associated shipping records, the manifests attached to those 47 invoices, because if there was a legitimate explanation, it would be in the manifests, in the itemized descriptions of cargo, in the documented chain of custody from origin to destination. What she found instead was an encrypted file partition she had never seen before. It sat behind the freight manifest folder like a room behind a wall. It was not listed in the directory index. It should not have been accessible through her clearance level, but the temporary access code Gerald had given her, a broad, improperly scoped permissions grant that an IT administrator would have wept to see, had not been configured to exclude it, and the partition opened when she clicked it the way a door opens when no one thought to lock it. She almost closed it without reading. She did not close it. Inside were 73 files organized by date over a 30-month period. The file names were alphanumeric strings, meaningless on their surface. She opened the first one. It was a shipping manifest, but not like any manifest she'd ever processed. The cargo descriptions were coded, freight weights listed in configurations that made no physical sense for the labeled container dimensions. Routing paths that moved through 4 intermediate ports before reaching documented destinations, with transfer windows too brief for the distances involved unless you weren't actually transporting the containers across those distances at all, just cycling documentation through the port records. She opened a second file, a third, a fourth. Her hands were very steady. That was the thing about Maris Holloway that people who didn't know her would never have guessed. Under pressure, her hands went steady. Her mind went sharp. She had learned this about herself in a crisis years ago, and she had never known whether to be grateful for it or frightened of what it meant about her. By the 12th file, she understood what she was looking at. By the 20th, she understood the scale of it. The Hargrove Meridian Corporation, one of Chicago's 3 largest logistics and freight management firms, publicly traded, award-winning, charitable foundation having, was running a weapons pipeline. Had been running it for at least 30 months through a ghost carrier network that existed only in documentation, cycling shipments through legitimate commercial freight routes to launder the physical movement of cargo that never appeared in any authorized description. The weight configurations that didn't make sense for labeled containers made perfect sense for equipment. The brief transfer windows at intermediate ports corresponded to documented activity at 3 facilities she recognized from industry publications as formerly operational military surplus processing centers. The final destinations, buried 6 redirections deep in the routing chains, traced to receiving entities that had no public-facing existence at all. She sat in the glow of her monitor in the empty office and felt something very cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. The recognition of a situation that had already passed the point where recognition did any good. She should close the partition, log out, go home. Forget she'd ever had the access code. She copied the files to a secure external drive instead. It took 11 minutes. She watched the progress bar with the particular focused calm of someone whose brain had temporarily outrun her ability to feel appropriately terrified. She was thinking about the 47 invoices, about Gerald Thorne's authorization stamp, about the fact that $12 million across 30 months was not accounting noise. It was operational funding for something that required sustained infrastructure, sustained silence, and sustained cooperation from someone with enough authority to move cargo through a major corporation's legitimate freight network without triggering a single compliance review. The drive finished transferring at 9:47 p.m. She was pulling it from the port when the elevator doors at the far end of the floor opened. She did not look up immediately. At this hour, it was maintenance or a forgotten phone or someone from the overnight IT team running a server check. She slid the drive into her jacket pocket and began closing the file windows on her monitor with the methodical efficiency of someone finishing up routine work. Behind her, she heard footsteps. 2 sets, moving with purpose, not the shuffling drift of maintenance workers. She pulled up her desktop background, straightened a folder on her desk, picked up her phone as though checking messages. The footsteps stopped 6 feet behind her. Maris Holloway. It wasn't a question. She turned. There were 2 of them, men in dark suits that were expensive in the wrong way. The way that meant they were chosen for ease of movement rather than aesthetics. The taller one had pale eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed incorrectly. The shorter one was younger and stood very still with his hands at his sides in the particular way of someone who had been trained to stand that way. "Yes," she said. "You've been working late," the tall one said. "Quarterly reconciliation." She kept her voice flat, matter of fact. Her heart was doing something to her ribcage that she chose not to acknowledge. "Freight invoicing. Gerald asked for it by Friday." "Gerald?" The tall one looked at his partner. Some exchange happened between them that had no visible component. Mr. Thorne doesn't know you're here tonight. I don't need his permission to work overtime. You accessed a restricted data partition at 9:31 p.m., the shorter one said. His voice was younger than his face, precise, clipped, like he'd practiced it. That access was logged. She felt the drive against her ribs through the jacket lining. I was reconciling a vendor discrepancy. I had authorized clearance, temporary clearance, the tall one said, which was supposed to be revoked 2 weeks ago. He took a step toward her, not rushing, the unhurried step of someone who has already decided how the next few minutes will go. We're going to need to see your workstation and your bag. Am I being accused of something? We're from corporate security. This is a routine check. Nothing about it was routine, and they knew she knew it. She glanced toward the elevator, 31 floors down to the lobby. 2 men between her and the only exit on this floor unless she used the stairwell, which was accessed through a door 40 feet to her left that she would have to reach before either of them did. She grabbed her bag from the desk in one motion and ran. She heard one of them shout, not a word, just the sharp functional sound of someone redirecting into pursuit, and she hit the stairwell door at full speed, shoulder first, and it slammed open into the concrete shaft, and she was running, taking the stairs 2 at a time down into the building's lower floors, the metal railing cold and slick under her palm, the sound of the door banging open behind her as they followed. 31 floors. She wasn't going to make it to the lobby before they called ahead. She cut off at the 22nd floor, shoved through the door into a darkened open-plan office space she had been in twice before for interdepartmental meetings, and moved through the rows of empty desks in near darkness, using only the ambient glow from the city outside the windows to navigate. Her breathing was coming hard but controlled. Breath in through the nose, out through the mouth, the rhythm her college track coach had drilled into her a decade ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with running from corporate assassins in a Chicago high-rise. She pressed herself against the wall beside a row of filing cabinets and listened. The stairwell door opened. One set of footsteps, moving cautiously now. She heard the soft click of a flashlight beam sweeping across the office. He wasn't calling out. That told her something she did not like about the nature of his intentions. Security personnel called out. They announced themselves. Men who moved silently through dark office floors after a woman they just chased down a flight of stairs were not interested in a conversation. She moved toward the service corridor at the far end of the floor, a maintenance access passage that ran behind the mechanical systems and connected to a secondary elevator bank used only by building operations. She had mapped this building in her first 6 months on the job the way she mapped every space she inhabited for any length of time, because that was a habit she'd developed after the years she'd spent in a bad apartment, in a bad building, in a part of the city where knowing the exits was not paranoia, it was arithmetic. She found the service corridor door in the dark. The handle was unlocked. She slipped through and pulled it shut behind her with both hands to avoid noise, and stood in the narrow utility passage with the low thrum of the building's HVAC system all around her and counted to 10. Then she moved toward the service elevator. It was slow, old. She rode it down to the parking structure beneath the building, sub-level 2, where her car was parked in her assigned spot, where there were cameras at every entrance, but the lane cameras had been offline for maintenance since Tuesday, something she knew because she had scheduled the maintenance window herself when IT submitted the service request to Gerald's calendar. The elevator opened into the parking garage, and she stepped out and the smell hit her. Oil and concrete and the particular stale cold of underground spaces. And she was already moving toward her car when she saw the third man. He was standing beside her vehicle, not leaning, standing, a different configuration than the 2 upstairs, older, broader, with the patient stillness of someone who has done waiting professionally for a long time. He was not pretending to be anything other than what he was. She stopped. He looked at her across the expanse of gray concrete without urgency. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "we just want the drive." She said nothing. "Hand it over and this is the end of it. You walk out. We forget the access violation. Everyone goes home." Her car was 30 feet to her left. He was between her and the exit ramp. The garage was empty of other people in every direction she could see, and she had been looking because she was always looking. "Who do you work for?" she said. "Hargrove Meridian Security." Try again. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly. Something more like professional regret, the kind that precedes a decision already made. He reached into his jacket. She ran again, not toward the exit ramp, but laterally, into the deeper lanes of the parking structure, past concrete columns and parked vehicles, and toward the far wall where she remembered, because she had noted it on a Thursday 6 months ago when she was parked unusually deep and couldn't find her car. There was a secondary stairwell access door that connected to the building's emergency egress system, the kind of door that was alarmed on the exit side but not the entry side. She heard him behind her, heavier footsteps, faster than she'd expected for his size. And she cut around a concrete column and felt the air move past her shoulder and heard a sound she had never heard outside of television but recognized instantly and comprehensively, a suppressed gunshot and the impact of it against the column a foot from her head. She did not process this in the way she might have expected. Some circuit inside her had tripped that she hadn't known existed. The world narrowed to the next 3 seconds. Column, lane, column, emergency door. She hit the emergency door at full speed, slammed through it, and the alarm shrieked to life behind her. But she was already in the stairwell and moving up, not down, because down was the building's lowest level and a dead end, and up brought her back to the underground connector passage that linked this tower to the adjacent parking complex through a maintenance walkway she had used exactly once, on a rainy afternoon 2 years ago when she'd been running late for a meeting in the next building and hadn't wanted to go outside. The alarm was still screaming. She could hear him in the stairwell below her. She came out of the stairwell on sublevel 1 and hit the maintenance walkway at a dead sprint, and ran through 50 feet of concrete tunnel with flickering fluorescent light overhead, and came out into the adjacent parking structure. The Meridian West Annex, older, half-empty, no card access required for pedestrian entry, and stopped running because running in an adjacent building after an alarm was a way to be remembered. She walked, quickly, steadily, to the pedestrian exit. Outside it was November and the wind off the lake cut straight through her jacket, and she turned north and kept moving and pulled out her phone and stared at it. Who did you call when you had evidence that a major corporation was running weapons through its freight network, and the men trying to retrieve that evidence had just tried to shoot you in a parking garage? She did not call the police. She had reasons for that. She hadn't fully articulated even to herself, reasons that lived in the part of her brain that processed things like how quickly those men had been mobilized, how cleanly they had accessed her workstation logs, how certain they had been, how arranged everything about the encounter had felt. Whatever she had stepped into had tentacles she couldn't see. The police in this city were not a monolith. Some of them could be trusted. Identifying which ones from a standing start in the middle of the night with 3 armed men behind her was not a calculation she was willing to make on faith. She walked 4 blocks north and ducked into the recessed doorway of a closed restaurant and pressed herself into the shadow and tried to think. The drive was still in her jacket pocket. Whatever was on it, and she had seen enough to understand what was on it, was the only piece of leverage she had. It was also the reason those men would not stop looking for her. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it for 2 seconds, then answered. Ms. Holloway. A man's voice. Quiet. Very composed. Not the voice of either of the 2 upstairs or the one in the garage. Deeper. With an accent she couldn't quite place. American, but polished in a way that suggested the polish was intentional. You've had an interesting evening. She said nothing. The men who were sent for you are not the last of what's coming, the voice said. You need to not be where you are. There's a black SUV at the corner of Wabash in Illinois. It will be there for 4 minutes. After that, it will leave, and I cannot guarantee your safety beyond the next half hour. Who is this? Someone who has a significant interest in those files not falling into the wrong hands. A pause. And in your continued breathing, which at the moment are the same interest. How do you know where I am? Because I have known where you are for considerably longer than tonight. Another pause, briefer. You have 3 minutes and 40 seconds to make a decision, Ms. Holloway. I'd suggest you not overthink it. The line went dead. She stood in the doorway for 10 seconds. She thought about the suppressed gunshot and the concrete column and the distance between them. She thought about the 73 encrypted files and what they meant about the people who had put them there and what those people were willing to do to recover them. She walked to the corner of Wabash in Illinois. The black SUV was there, idling, No plates visible from the approach angle. The rear door opened as she got within 10 feet of it, not from the inside, but it was triggered remotely. And the interior was dark. She could make out a single figure in the front passenger seat. The back was empty. She got in. The door closed. The vehicle moved immediately, smooth and unhurried, merging into the thin late-night traffic on Wabash heading north. The partition between front and back was glass, and through it she could see the driver, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, and in the passenger seat the figure she'd glimpsed, who did not turn around. She waited. 3 blocks. 4. They crossed the river. Then the passenger seat figure turned and looked at her through the glass partition, and she felt something shift in the room's architecture, some fundamental recalibration of everything she had assumed about where she was and who she was with. She knew his face. Everyone in Chicago's business world knew his face. Dorian Blackthorne, 45 years old, the CEO of Blackthorne Capital Meridian, the holding company that sat above Hargrove as a parent entity, a fact she had known in the abstract corporate structure way she knew many things, the way you knew weather patterns in cities you'd never visited. He appeared in the Tribune's business section 2 or 3 times a year, always photographed at a remove, at events, in groups, never in the close, personal way that profiled CEOs were typically captured. He had the kind of face that photographs made slightly wrong, as if the camera couldn't quite decide what it was looking at. Strong jaw, dark hair going silver at the temples, eyes that were a gray so pale they looked lightened, which in photographs read as coldness, but in the actual physical proximity of the SUV's rear compartment read as something considerably more complicated. "You opened the partition," he said. His voice through the glass was the same as it had been on the phone. Quiet. Deliberate. "I reconciled an invoice discrepancy," she said. "Your company has a data partition problem." "My company has several problems. You've just become aware of one of them." He studied her with the measuring attention of someone accustomed to making fast, accurate assessments. "Are you injured?" "No." "They fired at you." They missed. Something moved across his expression. Not surprise. Not quite relief. Something more compressed than either. "The drive you took from the 31st floor partition contains records of a freight operation that several parties are highly motivated to either possess or destroy. The men who came for you tonight were sent by someone inside Hargrove's operational division. They are not the only ones who know you accessed those files." "Who are you exactly?" she said. She kept her voice steady, and she was proud of herself for it. He did not answer immediately. The city moved past the windows, empty storefronts and lit intersections and the high geometric shapes of mid-rise buildings against the dark sky. The SUV was heading toward the Gold Coast. "I own the building you work in," he said finally. "The company that signs your paycheck, the freight contracts in that partition, and a number of other things that are not publicly documented." He paused. "Someone within the organization I own has been selling information about those other things to a competitor. The encrypted partition you found is evidence of that arrangement. The people who came for you tonight are trying to contain a leak that has already done significant damage." She turned this over. "You're saying someone inside your organization set this up?" "Yes." "And you're saying the 47 invoices and the $12 million are a shadow operation that was running without my authorization?" His voice stayed level, but something underneath it shifted. "Someone used my infrastructure, my clearances, and my company's legitimate freight network to build a pipeline to a rival. What you found tonight is the evidence of that betrayal." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are currently the only person outside my immediate circle who has seen those files, and because whoever sent those men to your workstation has resources inside this corporation that I have not yet fully mapped. You are not safe returning to your apartment. You are not safe contacting anyone through your current phone, and you are not safe until I understand the full scope of what that partition contains, which I have not yet been able to access because the encryption schema was constructed by someone who knew my standard decryption protocols and built around them." She felt the drive in her pocket again. "You want me to help you decrypt your own files?" "I want you to stay alive," he said. "The decryption would be a secondary benefit." He held her gaze through the glass partition for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "You ran 2 floors, found a maintenance corridor, used a building access point from memory, triggered an emergency alarm as a diversion, and crossed to an adjacent structure without a map, all in the dark, in the middle of a pursuit by armed men. "I pay attention to buildings," she said. "I know. I've been paying attention to you for some time, Ms. Holloway, longer than you would find comfortable." A pause. "There will be time for you to be angry about that. Not tonight." The SUV turned off the main boulevard onto a narrower residential street, and she saw ahead of them the approach to a building she recognized, a converted Beaux-Arts tower near the lakefront that had been extensively renovated into private residential units sometime in the last decade. The exterior was discreet in the way of buildings that housed people who could afford to be discreet. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere I can guarantee your safety while my team works." "Your penthouse." He did not seem surprised that she'd deduced it. "Yes." She stared at the building as they approached. Every rational calculation she had available to her in this moment said the same thing. She was in a vehicle with a man she did not truly know, heading into a building she had no independent access to, with a piece of evidence that multiple armed parties wanted to take from her by force. The rational calculus of self-preservation said to demand to be let out at the next intersection, to disappear into the city on her own terms with the drive and figure out her next move from a position of independence. She looked at the concrete column in her memory, at the space between where the bullet had hit and where her head had been. She stayed in the SUV. The building's underground entrance was gated, a heavy steel barrier that retracted automatically as they approached, triggered by something in the vehicle's system. The driver pulled them into a private elevator lobby that was entirely separated from the building's main residential infrastructure. The elevator that met them had no floor buttons, just a biometric panel that the driver used without ceremony. Maris stepped into the elevator and felt the city fall away beneath her as it rose. Dorian stood beside her in the confined space without speaking. Up close, he was taller than she'd registered from photographs. He wore a dark suit with no tie, the collar of his shirt open, and there was a quality to his stillness that she had not expected. Not the forced calm of a man controlling himself, but the natural stillness of a man for whom control required no effort. It should have been reassuring. It wasn't quite. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. She had a split second to register the space, vast, high-ceilinged, with a wall of windows that faced the lake, the water, a black mirror edged with city light, before three other people entered her field of vision. A woman, mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the compact energy of someone who moved quickly and thought faster, standing at a table arrayed with screens and equipment. Two men near the far wall who had the particular posture of professionally trained security, the kind who didn't fidget, didn't glance at her, simply registered her arrival and adjusted their standing positions fractionally. "This is Raina," Dorian said, indicating the woman at the table. "She runs operational intelligence for my organization. She's been tracking the partition access since 9/31. Rena looked at Maris with an expression that was not unfriendly and was not particularly warm and was primarily just assessing. "You know what you found?" Rena said. "Weapons trafficking through a ghost carrier network," Maris said. 30 months of documented operations. The routing obscures the final destinations, but the cargo weights and transfer configurations point to military-grade equipment. The authorization trail inside Hargrove runs to Gerald Thorne, but Thorne doesn't have the authority to have set up the carrier relationships independently. Someone above him built the framework and let him manage the documentation. Rena looked at Dorian. Dorian looked at Maris. "She's better than you said," Rena said. "I know," he said. Maris pulled the drive from her jacket pocket and set it on the table. "The encryption on the partition files," she said. "The schema uses a modified two-layer approach. I noticed the file headers don't conform to standard commercial protocols. Whoever built it used a hybrid structure. I've seen something similar in financial regulatory documents from a European compliance framework. If your people have worked with Basel IV implementation data, you might recognize the outer layers architecture." Rena sat down at her station with something that might, in different lighting, have been called respect. "Start talking," Rena said. And Maris, who had spent 4 years in a building full of people who looked through her, pulled a chair up to the table and started talking. She walked Rena through every file she'd opened, every routing anomaly she'd clocked, every document weight and timestamp that had flagged in her mind as structurally wrong. She had a memory for organizational data that she'd never fully understood, Not photographic exactly, more architectural, the way some people held the layout of buildings. She held the layout of documents and their internal logic. An invoice inconsistency she'd opened at 9:20 p.m. felt as present and detailed as if she were still reading it. Rena worked while Maris talked, cross-referencing what Maris described against parallel data on her screens, moving fast with an efficiency that told Maris this woman had been doing exactly this kind of work for years. The two men near the wall remained where they were. Dorian had moved to the window, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the lake. At some point, Maris registered that it was past midnight. At some point, she registered that she was not afraid anymore, which was either a sign that she had processed the danger and contextualized it, or a sign that she was running on adrenaline past the point of useful emotional signal. She decided not to examine that too closely. At 1:15 in the morning, Rena looked up from her screens. "The outer encryption layer is what she said," Rena told Dorian. "Basal variant hybrid. I can get through it. The inner layer is different, purpose-built, not commercially derived. Someone who knows our standard protocols built specifically around them." She paused. This wasn't an outside operator. This was someone with intimate knowledge of how we secure sensitive operational data. "How intimate?" Dorian said, still facing the window. "Senior circle intimate. Inner ring access to our security architecture." Silence. Dorian turned from the window and his expression was not rage and not grief, which Maris might have expected from a man learning that someone very close to him had sold his empire's operational secrets to a rival. It was something colder and more deliberate. The expression of a man who had already suspected this and was now confirmed and was in the process of rerouting every subsequent calculation accordingly. Cross-reference the authorization signatures from the partition files against the security clearance holders with inner ring access, he said. "I want a name before morning." "I'll have it sooner than that," Rena said. Dorian looked at Maris. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm not tired. You're running on shock chemistry, and you'll crash in the next 90 minutes regardless of what you think you want." He said it without condescension, a statement of mechanism, not criticism. "There's a room prepared. When Rena has the decryption completed, we'll need you back. Your read of the routing patterns is faster than anything my team can produce cold." She looked at him. "I'm an executive assistant," she said. "You were an executive assistant." He held her gaze with those pale gray eyes that the cameras had always gotten wrong. "That ended at 9:31 p.m. when you opened the partition. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was accurate in the way of things that had already happened and could not unhappen." She took the room. It was on the penthouse's north side. Large, spare, with windows that faced the lake from a different angle. She sat on the edge of the bed in her work clothes and looked at the water. The city's distant glow reflected on its surface in broken, shifting patterns. She could hear the wind against the glass, high and thin. She thought about Gerald Thorne's authorization stamp on 47 invoices. She thought about who would have needed to build an infrastructure above Gerald to route those shipments, to establish the ghost carrier relationships, to construct the encryption partition and embed it in the freight archive where no one would think to look. She thought about what Dorian Blackthorne had said, that someone in his inner circle had built around their own security protocols. She thought about what that meant, about who would have had both the motivation to betray him and the structural access to do it this thoroughly, this invisibly, over 30 months. Someone who smiled at him across conference tables, someone he trusted. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Outside, the lake moved in the dark, enormous and indifferent, and somewhere in the city the men who had come for her tonight were regrouping, and whoever had sent them was learning that she had not been recovered and was deciding what to do next. Maris Holloway lay down on top of the bed covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep. Not for a long time. And when she finally did, it was to the sound of Rena's voice carrying from the other room. Sharp, certain, saying a name she could not quite make out. A name that was apparently enough to make one of the men by the wall say, under his breath, something that sounded like disbelief. She was still trying to hear it clearly when exhaustion finally pulled her under. By morning, she would know the name. By morning, she would understand that knowing it was only the beginning of what came next, and that whoever had planted a traitor this deep inside Dorian Blackthorne's empire was not finished. They had wanted the drive. They hadn't gotten it. And people like that, people who built 30-month weapons pipelines inside legitimate corporations without anyone seeing them, did not accept setbacks without answering them with something significantly worse. The city lights burned beyond the glass. The lake moved. And deep in the fortress above Chicago, the storm that had been building in the dark for 2.5 years finally had a direction. The name was Vincent Cray. Maris heard it clearly at 6:14 in the morning when Rena said it a second time, louder, because Dorian had not responded to the first. She was standing in the doorway of the room they'd given her, still in yesterday's clothes, her hair pulled back with a rubber band she'd found in her jacket pocket. She had slept maybe 90 minutes. Her mouth tasted like copper and stale air, and the particular flatness that came after adrenaline finished burning through a system and left nothing behind. Dorian was standing at the central table. He had changed, dark shirt, no jacket, and he was holding a coffee cup that he had apparently stopped drinking from at some point in the last few minutes. His knuckles were white around the ceramic. "Say it again," he said. "Vincent Cray," Rena said. She did not look away from her screens. "CFO, 14-year tenure, inner ring security clearance since year 3. His authorization signature is embedded in the encryption architecture of the partition, not as an access credential, as a construction signature. He built the partition. He built the carrier framework. He's been running it out of a subsidiary account structure that mirrors legitimate intercompany transfers closely enough that standard compliance review would pass it without flagging." The room was very quiet. One of the men near the wall, the taller one, who Maris had learned overnight was named Garrett, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. The other one, younger, named Cole, did not move at all, but something in his face tightened. Dorian set the coffee cup down on the table with controlled precision. "Vincent," he said. Not a question, not an exclamation, just the name, said in the voice of someone sorting through the implications of a thing they will never fully stop being surprised by. 14 years, Maris said from the doorway. Everyone looked at her. She walked into the room. 14 years of access, of trust building, of learning your security architecture from the inside. She moved to the table and looked at Rena's screens. This wasn't opportunistic. The framework is too clean. The carrier relationships took time to establish. You don't build ghost freight infrastructure in a quarter. He was planning this for years before he executed it. Dorian looked at her. "You reviewed my CFO's financial architecture in the last 4 hours. Rena walked me through the subsidiary structure while you were on the phone at 4 a.m. I cross-referenced it against the routing logic in the partition files." She held his gaze. "The 30-month timeline in the files isn't when the operation started. It's when it reached operational scale. The groundwork goes back further, probably 5 years." Something moved through Dorian's expression that she could not fully read. It was not the cold deliberateness she'd seen last night. It was something raw, underneath the control, moving fast like a current under ice. "Where is he now?" Dorian said to Rena. "His residential tracker shows him at his home in Lincoln Park. He hasn't moved since 11 last night. He doesn't know we have the files. He knows someone accessed the partition. He sent the men to the 31st floor, but if those men haven't reported back to him yet—" "They haven't reported to him," Dorian said. "They reported to whoever is running operational security on this, which is not Vincent directly." He straightened. "Vincent is the architect. He's not the hands. He has a handler on the outside, the rival he's been feeding this to." Rena pulled up a secondary screen. Lucien Vasseur. Maris did not know the name. The way Garrett and Cole went still told her the name meant something to them that it didn't mean to her. "Who is Vasseur?" she said. No one answered immediately. That particular silence, the kind that meant the answer was being decided rather than retrieved, told her more than the answer would have. "He runs the Eastern Syndicate," Dorian said finally. "Operates out of Detroit but has significant infrastructure in Chicago. We've had a boundary arrangement for 11 years, mutually understood territory lines. He's operated inside them." A pause. "Or I believed he had." "He used Vincent to build a pipeline inside your own freight network," Maris said. "Not to steal territory, to steal your weapons operation, to steal the infrastructure, the carrier relationships, the routing protocols, the port-level contact network. With that information, he doesn't need to take territory. He can replicate my operation independently and undercut every arrangement I have in place." And you'd have no way of knowing until the arrangement started collapsing. Correct. She thought about that, about the patience required for it, about a man who had been willing to spend years building the precondition for a single decisive move. He's not done, she said. Dorian looked at her. Vincent accessed the partition to check the file integrity 2 days ago, Rena said, reading from her screen. Routine maintenance access, logged at the system level. He would have seen the timestamp anomaly from Ms. Holloway's access almost immediately. Which means Vasseur knows the partition was accessed, Dorian said. Within hours of it happening, yes. And he knows his men didn't recover the drive. Rena hesitated. The team that went to the 31st floor reported in to an external relay. I've been tracking the relay. Last transmission was at 11:47 p.m., after you brought Ms. Holloway here. The transmission confirmed the drive was not recovered. Dorian was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, lock the building, full protocol. Garrett moved without hesitation, crossing to the security panel on the far wall. Cole took a position by the elevator. Maris watched this happen and felt the architecture of the situation reorganize itself around her with the particular clarity of a system snapping into a new configuration. Last night, she had been running. This morning, she was inside something, inside its walls, inside its logic, inside the thinking of a man who had built it and was now watching someone else try to use it against him. She wasn't sure when the difference had started to matter to her. She noted that it did. I need to talk to Vincent, Dorian said. Rena looked up. You bring him in now. Vasseur knows we have him. I'm not bringing him in. Dorian's voice was even. I'm going to him. I know what it is. He looked at Garrett. 2-car configuration. You and Cole. No additional personnel. If Vincent has a monitoring arrangement with Vasseur's people, a larger footprint signals intent. And if he runs, Garrett said. He won't run. He's been maintaining his cover for 14 years. He's not going to break it over an unconfirmed access anomaly. Dorian picked his jacket up from the back of a chair. He's going to sit in his kitchen in Lincoln Park and drink his coffee and wait to see how much I know. He buttoned his jacket, looked at Maris. Stay with Rena, he said. Don't leave the floor. I wasn't planning to. I know what you were planning. I'm saying it anyway. He held her gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than the operational content of the instruction warranted. The decryption. Keep working it with Rena. The inner layer files are what we need. Everything we have so far is the outer architecture. The inner files will have the contact ledger, the names and locations of everyone in the carrier network, and Vasseur's receiving infrastructure, his warehouse locations, his distribution chain inside Chicago. He moved toward the elevator. That's the entirety of his operation. With those files, he has leverage. Without them, he has a plan and no proof of it. So we're both racing for the inner layer, she said. He stopped at the elevator. Yes, he said, and the door opened and he stepped in and was gone. Maris stood in the penthouse and listened to the building hum around her and thought about 14 years. About what it cost a person to maintain a performance for 14 years. To smile across conference tables and share meals and handle the intimate details of a man's empire while feeding that empire's organs to a rival, piece by piece, in the dark. She sat down next to Rena. Show me the inner layer architecture, she said. Rena pulled it up without comment. The inner encryption layer was elegant in the way of things built by someone who genuinely understood what they were protecting and why. Maris worked through it with the methodical attention she gave to everything. Not fast, but accurate, cross-referencing the structural patterns against her memory of the European compliance framework she'd flagged last night, looking for the seams in the logic where a modified commercial encryption structure met a custom-built one. The seams were always where you got in. Every hybrid system had them. She found the first seam 40 minutes later. Here, she said, pulling Rena's attention to a specific file header structure. The outer layer's verification protocol expects a hash confirmation at this position. The inner layer's custom architecture generates a hash response that's 4 bits longer than the outer layer expects, which means the verification handshake fails at authentication and the outer layer assumes the inner layer is inaccessible. But the inner layer isn't locked. It's just speaking a different dialect. Rena stared at the screen. If we build a translation bridge at the handshake point, we bypass the authentication failure entirely. Yes. Maris leaned forward. It'll take maybe 2 hours. Maybe less. Rena was already building it. Maris sat back and rolled her neck and listened to the lake wind against the glass. Her back ached. Her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sand. She had not eaten since lunch the previous day, and the coffee Rena had handed her an hour ago had been the only input her body had received since she'd run down a stairwell with a gunshot in the wall behind her. She thought about her apartment, about her cat, a 7-year-old gray tabby named Silt, who would be annoyed rather than worried at her absence, because Silt was constitutionally incapable of worry and managed disapproval as his primary mode of emotional engagement. She thought about her mother in Rockford, who called every Sunday and who Maris told nothing true to in those calls, not because she was dishonest, but because her mother was a nervous woman and there was nothing to be gained by translating Maris's life into terms that would frighten her. She thought about Dorian Blackthorne, currently in a car heading toward a man who had spent 14 years betraying him, and she thought about what that conversation was going to look like. Her phone buzzed. She'd turned it off last night per Rena's instruction, then back on an hour ago when Rena confirmed the number was clean. The incoming message was from an unknown number, and it said, "He knows you're there. Leave now." She held the phone very still. Rena. Rena looked over, read the message on the screen Maris angled toward her, and her expression changed in a way that was not quite fear, but was the thing that lived adjacent to it in people who were professionally trained not to show fear. "That's not from our people," Rena said. "Obviously." "The number?" Rena pulled up a trace tool. "Relay chain. Give me a minute." "We may not have a minute," Maris said. She turned the message over in her mind. "He knows you're there, not Dorian, not Garrett. He. Vasseur." Vasseur knew she was in the penthouse, which meant the penetration of Dorian's organization was not limited to Vincent Cray's architecture. There was an active intelligence feed running into Vasseur's operation from somewhere currently inside these walls, or connected to them. "The building security team," she said. Rena's head came up. "Full protocol lockdown," Maris said. "Dorian called it. How many people executed it?" "Garrett ran the panel. The external protocols route to the building security desk." "Who's on the building security desk?" Rena's face went very still. "Night shift rotation," Rena said. "I don't have the roster memorized." "Who assigns the night shift rotation?" A pause. "Vincent's administrative division." They looked at each other across the table. "Call Dorian," Maris said. Rena was already reaching for her earpiece. She got nothing. She tried twice, then said quietly and precisely, "He's not picking up." She tried Garrett. Same result. "The relay is clean on our end. They're either in a dead zone or they were expected," Maris said. She stood up from the table. Her mind was running the architecture of the building from memory. The penthouse floor plan, as she had registered it last night and this morning, the elevator access, the stairwell configuration, the position of the security panel Garrett had engaged, the sightlines from the windows. The lockdown that Dorian had ordered had closed the building's external access points. It had not closed the building's internal access points. If someone on the security desk had been feeding information to Vasseur's network, they could open internal pathways without triggering the external lockdown protocols. They could route personnel through the building's service infrastructure, the same service infrastructure that Maris had used last night to escape the 31st floor. She knew this building's bones. So did whoever had planted someone on the security desk. "How many exits from this floor?" she said. "Elevator and the emergency stair on the east side," Rena said. She had a weapon in her hand, a compact sidearm she had produced from somewhere on her person with the practiced speed of someone who kept it accessible rather than stored. "We have maybe 4 minutes before—" The emergency stair door on the east side of the penthouse opened, not with a crash, not with a shout, with the quiet, purposeful sound of a well-maintained door on good hinges, operated by someone who was in no hurry because they were not expecting resistance. The first man through it was large, moving low, with a rifle configuration that was too military for a security guard and not military enough for a special operations soldier, the middle space of well-paid private personnel. He cleared the door frame and moved left to create a lane, the way you did it when more people were coming through behind you. Rena fired twice, clean and fast. The man went down. The door swung back closed. Silence for 2 seconds. Then Maris heard them on the other side of it, the sounds of reorganization, of men adjusting to the reality that the room was not undefended. She was already moving, not toward the door but across the room to the security panel that Garrett had engaged during lockdown. She had watched Garrett's hands when he'd activated it. Not all of it. Enough. There's a secondary lockdown layer, she said. Building sections. If I can isolate the east stair corridor. The panel needs a biometric, Rena said, moving to cover the elevator door while keeping sightlines on the east stair. I know. Maris looked at the panel. Garrett's biometric had activated the outer protocol. But the section isolation controls were a subordinate function. A management tier, not a security tier. The access control schema for subordinate functions was different from the master protocol. She had seen this architecture before in a different context, not in a building, but in a financial regulatory compliance structure, where primary and subordinate authorization tiers were kept separate specifically to allow operational management without requiring executive sign-off on routine decisions. She pressed her thumb to the panel. It rejected her. She held her hand flat against the panel's sensor field instead of using a fingertip. Some older generation biometric systems in high-end residential construction. She had read this in a facilities management journal she'd processed for Gerald's building committee review 2 years ago, one of thousands of documents she'd absorbed without knowing why. Some older systems used a palm vein scan as a secondary authorization pathway for management access, legacy designed to allow facilities managers to operate building sections without primary security credentials. The panel read her palm. It accepted. She hit the section isolation for the east stair corridor. From the other side of the door came the heavy mechanical sound of security barriers engaging in the corridor walls, the kind of physical barriers that belonged to a building built by a man who understood that access control was not a digital problem but an architectural one. Maris stepped back from the panel. Her hand was shaking. She looked at it. Then she closed it into a fist, and the shaking stopped. 2 more entry points, Rena said from across the room. Service corridor access behind the kitchen, and the roof. They'll know the stairs sealed, Maris said. They'll split. 1 team to the service corridor, 1 team to... Her phone buzzed again. She looked at it. Same unknown relay number. This time the message said, lobby, ground floor. He's walking into it. Dorian. She thought about the 2-car configuration heading to Lincoln Park. About Vincent Cray sitting in his kitchen, waiting to see how much Dorian knew. About the relay transmission at 11:47 p.m. confirming the drive had not been recovered. About a man with 14 years of patience and an active handler who had just learned that Dorian was mobile and his location was trackable. The penthouse was not the primary target. It had never been the primary target. She was not the primary target. They're here to keep us occupied, she said. Rena looked at her. The men on the east stair, the service corridor, the roof, they're not here to take the drive. Vassar knows where Dorian is going. He knew before Dorian left. She was moving toward the elevator. Vincent knew. He knew Dorian was coming, and he called it in, and now there's a team waiting at the lobby of his building in Lincoln Park, and Dorian is walking into it without knowing the penetration runs deeper than the security desk. You can't go out there, Rena said. I'm not going out there. Maris stopped at the elevator. I'm calling him. Give me a clean channel, right now. The relay is compromised. Then give me something that isn't on the relay. A hardware channel, a direct frequency, something you use when the digital infrastructure can't be trusted. Rena stared at her for 1 second. Then she crossed to a drawer beneath the equipment table and pulled out a device that was small, matte gray, and distinctly not a commercial product. Short-range encrypted burst, Rena said. Quarter-mile range. If he's in Lincoln Park, he's not at Lincoln Park yet. Maris took the device. He left 9 minutes ago in a 2-car configuration. Traffic on the north end is heavy this time of morning. He's not there yet. She keyed the device. Dorian. She held the transmit open. Nothing. She tried again. Dorian, it's Maris. Do not go to Vincent's location. Do you hear me? Do not go to the location. Vincent knew you were coming before you left this building. There's a team waiting. The penetration is deeper than Cray. Someone on the building security desk was feeding your position. I need you to hear this. Static. Then, through it, his voice, distant, compressed by the encryption but unmistakable. I hear you. Don't go to Lincoln Park. A pause. Long enough that she counted it. I'm already here, he said. And through the encrypted burst she heard very distinctly, in the background of his transmission, The sound of something she had heard once before in a parking garage beneath a glass tower on a November night. The sharp, suppressed crack of a weapon being fired, and the sound of men moving, and then Dorian's voice cutting off mid-breath as the transmission died. Maris stood in the middle of the penthouse, holding the gray device against her sternum, and listened to the static where his voice had been and felt something cold and absolute move through her chest. Not panic, not the hot spiraling thing panic was, but something slower and more structural, like a load-bearing wall recognizing the moment before it fails. She keyed the device again. Nothing. Again. Static. She counted to 5 and tried a 4th time and got the same compressed emptiness that meant either the device had lost range or the signal environment on his end had changed catastrophically. She set the device on the table. Rena was watching her from across the room with the gun still in her hand and an expression that had moved past professional composure into something raw. "I lost him," Maris said. "I heard. What's his security configuration in the field? If the 2-car team is compromised, if Garrett and Cole are—" "Dorian doesn't go down easy," Rena said. The way she said it was not bravado. It was the flat declarative of someone reporting observed fact across many years of evidence. Easy isn't the question. The question is whether he walked into a prepared position with an element of surprise against him. Maris moved back to the equipment table. Behind the kitchen wall, she could hear nothing yet from the service corridor. Either the secondary team was moving carefully or they were waiting for a signal. "Pull up his vehicle tracker." "It'll be offline. Standard field protocol. Transponders go dark when the team goes operational." "Then pull up the street cameras around Lincoln Park. Vincent Cray's residential address." Rena sat down at her station and worked. Maris stood behind her and watched the screens populate with city camera feeds. The intersections around a quiet residential block in Lincoln Park at 7:20 in the morning, the streets still carrying the thin, pale light of a November dawn, a few dog walkers, a delivery truck on the cross street, bare trees against a white sky. Then Rena found the block. 2 black vehicles pulled to the curb. One of them was Dorian's. The other was not. It was parked 50 yards north and had been there, Rena confirmed by pulling back the camera timeline, for 41 minutes, before Dorian had left the penthouse. "He walked into a perimeter," Maris said. The camera feed showed movement, 4 men emerging from the northern vehicle. Then the doors of Dorian's cars opening. Garrett first, then Cole, using the vehicles as cover, and between them, moving low and fast toward the nearest building entrance, Dorian. He was upright. He was moving under his own power. Maris let out a breath she had not registered holding. The camera angle was not good. A traffic intersection feed, the wrong geometry for the action happening mid-block. But she could track the general shape of it. Garrett engaging left, Cole right. Dorian through the entrance of what appeared to be a brownstone 3 doors down from Vincent Cray's address. Then the service corridor door behind the kitchen moved. Not opened. Moved. The handle depressing fractionally, the way a handle moved when someone on the other side tested it carefully to determine whether it was locked. Rena brought her weapon up. Maris did not move. She was watching the handle. It depressed. Held. Released. Silence. "They're waiting," Maris said quietly. "They want us to commit to a position." "Or they're breaching on account," Rena said. "If they were breaching on account, the East Stair team would have already come through." Maris thought about the building section isolation she'd triggered. The stair corridor was physically sealed. It would take cutting equipment or explosives to breach it, and neither of those was a quiet option in a residential tower. "They can't come through the stair. The service corridor is their only soft entry point. One team, one direction. That's a holding action, not an assault. You think Vasseur's primary objective isn't the penthouse. I think the men in this building are here to make sure we stay in this building." She looked at the camera feeds on Rena's screens. The primary objective is on that street in Lincoln Park. Rena stared at the feeds. On the camera, the 4 men from the northern vehicle had taken positions on the block that were too geometrically precise for a spontaneous response, 2 covering the brownstone entrance Dorian had used, 2 moving to cover the rear egress. They were not trying to breach. They were containing. "Vincent Cray isn't in his house," Maris said. She had been building this for the last 3 minutes, and it had just reached the point of certainty. He knew Dorian was coming. He cleared out and left the block covered. Dorian went into that brownstone to flank the position, and now he's inside a building he doesn't know with a contained perimeter and no clean exit. That's a trap, Rena said. It's a very patient trap. Maris moved toward the elevator. One that was set before last night, before the partition was accessed. This was already in motion, the penthouse breach team, the Lincoln Park perimeter, all of it. Vincent didn't improvise this after the partition access. He had this ready. The partition access just accelerated the timeline. Maris. Rena's voice carried something in it that made Maris stop with her hand on the elevator panel. If this was pre-built, if Vincent had this prepared, then Vasseur already has what he needs from the inner layer files. Maris turned. Say that again. The inner layer files, the contact ledger, the receiving infrastructure, the distribution chain. Rena's face was very still. Vincent built the partition. He built the encryption. He also built the inner layer's content. She looked at her screens. He didn't need us to decrypt it. He's been running that operation for 30 months. He already has every name, every location, every arrangement in that ledger. He doesn't need the files. He was never trying to get the files back. The room reorganized itself again. He was trying to get the drive back because... Maris stopped. Because it's evidence, Rena said. The only documented proof that ties the operation to Hargrove's freight infrastructure. Without the drive, without those files, there's no evidence trail that leads back through the corporation to Dorian. The weapons operation could be restarted under different infrastructure with no legal exposure. And with Dorian contained or eliminated, there's no one left to pursue it. Rena's voice had gone very quiet. This was never about stopping the leak. It was about clearing the board. Vincent hands Vasseur the Chicago operation. Vasseur eliminates Dorian, and the entire thing gets rebuilt from scratch under Vasseur's control. Maris stood very still in the middle of the penthouse and let the full geometry of it settle into place. 14 years. Not of patience, of construction. Vincent Cray had spent 14 years not merely feeding information to a rival, but building the precise conditions under which that rival could execute a complete takeover. Organizational, operational, personal. The weapons pipeline was not the goal. It was the leverage that made the goal achievable. She pressed the elevator button. You can't go out there, Rena said again. I'm not going to Lincoln Park. Maris looked at her. I'm going to Vincent. Vincent is not in Lincoln Park. He cleared out of his house before Dorian arrived, which means he had somewhere to go. He's not running. He's managing. He's watching this play out from somewhere he controls. She held Rena's gaze. Where does Vincent Cray go when he needs to manage something off-book? Rena was quiet for 3 seconds. He has a secondary office, she said slowly, not listed under his name. It's in the West Loop, a private suite inside a commercial building that we identified in the subsidiary account structure 3 months ago, but couldn't connect to him directly. Dorian flagged it as a potential operational node, but we didn't have enough confirmation to That's where he is. The elevator opened. Maris stepped in. Address. Maris? Rena's voice sharpened. You walk in there alone. I'm not walking in there to confront him. I'm walking in there because he doesn't know what I look like. She held the elevator door. He knows someone accessed the partition. He knows a woman was recovered from the parking garage by Dorian's team. He does not know my name, my face, or that I've spent the last 6 hours reconstructing his entire operational architecture. She paused. I'm invisible, Rena. I've been invisible my entire career. Tonight, that's the only weapon I have. Rena stared at her. Then she picked up a pen and wrote an address on the back of a printed page and crossed the room and held it out. Service exit from the building, Rena said. Sublevel 3. It connects to the adjacent building's parking structure. There's a vehicle registered to a corporate entity that doesn't trace back to Dorian. Keys are in the console. She held Maris's gaze. Get eyes on him. Get out. Do not engage. If you engage, you're dead. Maris took the address. Keep trying, Dorian, she said. I won't stop. She went down. The city in November at 7:30 in the morning was gray and purposeful. People moving on the sidewalks with the compressed energy of a place that ran continuously and impersonally. The lake wind cutting east to west across the cross streets with the particular sharpness that Chicago saved for days that were not cold enough to justify stopping, but too cold to ignore. Maris drove the corporate vehicle, a dark sedan, 3 years old, aggressively ordinary, through the morning traffic and kept her breathing even, and did not think about the suppressed gunshot she had heard through the encrypted burst transmission, because thinking about it did not help her, and arriving at the West Loop address, intact, did. The building was a mid-rise commercial block, 12 floors of late 90s construction, the kind of building that housed accounting firms and mid-tier law practices and the administrative offices of businesses that needed a respectable address without the overhead of a premium location. She parked on the cross street and sat in the car and looked at the building's entrance for 3 minutes. No visible security beyond the standard lobby desk. 2 camera positions on the exterior, standard commercial coverage. The entrance foot traffic was building toward the morning peak, people arriving with coffee cups and messenger bags, the ordinary machinery of a workday beginning. She was wearing yesterday's dark slacks and gray blazer. She looked like someone arriving for a meeting. She walked in. The lobby desk attendant was young, barely 20, with the half-attentive posture of someone whose surveillance capability was limited to checking IDs for scheduled visitors. Maris did not approach the desk. She walked to the building directory on the far wall and scanned it with the focused efficiency of someone who knew what they were looking for, which she did not, and found nothing under Vincent Cray or any name she recognized. The directory listed companies by suite number. She was looking for a suite that corresponded to the subsidiary account structure she'd seen in the financial records, a company name that had appeared in the account ledgers as a shell entity, something called Meridian West Consulting Group, Suite 804. She took the elevator. The 8th floor was quieter than the lobby, a corridor lined with frosted glass office fronts, the muffled sound of phones and keyboards, the ambient hum of a floor that was occupied but not busy. Suite 804 was at the far end of the corridor, its frosted glass darker than the others, the light behind it lower. A small placard beside the door read, Meridian West Consulting, in the understated font of an entity that did not need to advertise. She stood in the corridor outside it and listened. Voices. 2 of them. Male. Speaking at a level that was controlled but not calm, the register of a conversation that was managing urgency rather than discussing routine business. She recognized one voice immediately. She had processed 4 years of his calendar, his correspondence, his interdepartmental memos. She knew the cadence of his speech the way you knew the sound of a door in a house you'd lived in long enough, without having to identify it consciously, because identification was not the point. The point was recognition, immediate and comprehensive. Gerald Thorne, not Vincent Cray. Gerald Thorne was in Suite 804 at 7:40 in the morning, speaking in the controlled urgent register of a man managing a crisis. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door and listened, and the conversation became audible in fragments. Not enough to reconstruct completely, but enough to hear Gerald say the drive is still out there, and enough to hear the second voice, which she now understood was not Vincent Cray, respond, "It doesn't matter, it's already done." She can't prove any of it without the authorization chain, and enough to hear Gerald say, with a sharpness she had never heard in 4 years of working for him, "The authorization chain runs through my stamp. Vincent made sure of that. If anyone reads those files, I'm the one who goes down for it." She stood very still against the wall. Gerald. Gerald Thorne, who had handed her an improperly scoped clearance code 2 weeks ago. Gerald Thorne, whose authorization stamp appeared on 47 invoices totaling $12 million. Gerald Thorne, who had forgotten to revoke her access. He had not forgotten. She understood this with the absolute finality of a mathematical proof reaching its conclusion. The clearance code, the timing, the access that had been left open precisely long enough for a sufficiently thorough assistant to find the partition and open it. Gerald had not made an error. Gerald had made a choice. To expose the partition to someone who would document it and remove the documentation before Vasseur's people could eliminate it, because Gerald was not a principal in this operation. Gerald was a liability, and liabilities sometimes tried to create insurance. He had used her. He had pointed her at the files like a tool, knowing that someone would come for her, and that someone with enough resources might intercept the recovery. He had calculated that Dorian's organization would move to protect the drive before Vasseur's team could eliminate her. He had not calculated that she would be sitting outside his door at 7:40 in the morning. "You understand what I'm telling you," Gerald said through the door. His voice had dropped lower. "If Blackthorne reconstructs the authorization chain from those files, I need to not be findable." That was the arrangement. Vincent promised me that was the arrangement. A pause. The second voice. Vincent's arrangement is no longer operative. Silence. She heard Gerald's breathing change, the way breathing changed when a person understood something they had been choosing not to understand. What does that mean? He said. It means the operation has moved past the phase where your arrangement with Vincent has functional relevance. I have documentation. I kept records, dates, communications, every instruction Vincent gave me. I kept them off system, hard copy, in a location that nobody... Gerald. The second voice was very patient. Where are they? The silence that followed was the silence of a man recognizing the shape of the situation he was actually in, which was not the situation he had believed himself to be in, which was not an uncommon experience for people who made arrangements with men like Lucien Vasseur. Maurice had her phone out. She was recording. She recorded 3 more minutes of it, Gerald describing the location of his hard copy records, the second voice confirming the address back to him in the tone of someone committing it to a different kind of memory, and Gerald's increasingly fragile attempts to renegotiate terms that had never been terms at all. Then she heard a sound she recognized from a parking garage on the previous night, and she heard Gerald make a sound she could not name and did not want to, and she heard a body make contact with a floor. She was already moving, not away from the door, but pressing herself into the shallow alcove of the adjacent suite's entrance and making herself as small as her body allowed. Because the door to 804 was going to open in the next 10 seconds, and whoever came through it was going to look in both directions along the corridor with the specific attention of someone exiting a room where something irreversible had just occurred. The door opened. He was mid-40s, medium height, lean, with the kind of face that held no particular expression as its resting state. Not cold exactly, just unoccupied, the face of someone for whom other people's interiors were logistical rather than emotional information. He wore a gray coat over a dark suit. He looked left. He looked right. His gaze passed over the alcove where she was standing with her back pressed to the glass, and her hands absolutely still, and her breathing reduced to the shallow mechanical minimum her body required. He did not see her. She had spent 31 years being invisible. She had never needed it this badly. He walked to the elevator. She watched him from the alcove without moving. The elevator opened and he stepped in and the doors closed. She counted to 10. Then she crossed to 804 and opened the door, and Gerald Thorne was on the floor against the far wall, and there was blood, and he was still breathing, just barely, with the effortful, shallow breathing of a man whose body was attempting to sustain a situation that had become structurally untenable. And she knelt next to him, and he looked at her with eyes that registered her face and could not, in the span of time he had remaining, seem to decide what to do with the recognition. "The hard copy records," she said. "Where?" He looked at her. "Gerald." She kept her voice even. There was no time for anything other than even. "The records you kept. Where are they? If they document what Vincent told you to do, they document the instruction chain above your authorization stamp. They're the only thing that shows you were directed. Tell me where they are." His lips moved. She leaned closer. He told her. Then she stood up and called the emergency line and gave the address and walked out of the suite and down the corridor and to the elevator, and she stood in it as it descended, and her hands were shaking again, both of them this time. And she closed them both into fists and held them closed and felt her heart beat in her fingertips like something trying to get out. The lobby, the street, the car. She sat in the driver's seat and pulled up the recording on her phone and listened to 40 seconds of it to confirm it was clear and audible, and it was. Then her phone rang. "Dorian." She answered. "I'm out," he said. His voice was compressed, slightly rough at the edges, the voice of a man who had been running. "Garrett took a hit. He's stable. Cole got us clear." A pause, and in it she heard him breathing. "Vincent wasn't there." "I know," she said. "Vincent was never the top of it. He was the architect, but he wasn't the principal. Gerald Thorne was the liability they were using as the documented fall guy, his stamp on every invoice, his clearance code on the partition access." She paused. "Gerald is down. West Loop, I called it in." Silence on the line. "You went to the West Loop," he said. "I found the secondary suite, Meridian West Consulting, Suite 804. Another silence, different from the first. "You went alone," he said. I was invisible. She started the car. I have a recording of Gerald's conversation with one of Vasseur's men. He gave up the location of his hard copy records, the off-system documentation of every instruction Vincent gave him. It's a full instruction chain from Vasseur through Vincent to Gerald. She pulled into traffic. And Dorian, the man in that room with Gerald, he wasn't security. He was operational. Vasseur sent someone personally to close the Gerald problem, which means Vasseur is still in Chicago. He hasn't left yet. The line was very quiet. Where are you now? Dorian said. Heading back to you. She checked the mirror. The street behind her was ordinary and continuous. But we need Gerald's records before Vasseur's people get to them. And we need to find Vasseur before he decides that leaving Chicago cleanly requires one more problem to be closed. She didn't say which problem. She didn't need to. I know, Dorian said, and the way he said it, quiet, certain, with something underneath it that was not coldness, but was the thing that existed in a man when coldness was no longer sufficient, told her that he understood exactly what she had not said, and that the final phase of everything that had been set in motion the previous night at 9:31 p.m. in an empty office above a black glass tower was already beginning, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Gerald's hard copy records were in a safety deposit box at a private vault facility in River North. Not a bank, one of those independent storage operations that catered to people who needed documentation kept outside institutional oversight, the kind of place that asked no questions because its business model depended on not asking questions. Gerald had given Maris the box number and the access code in the last coherent minute of his life, and she had written them on the back of the address Rena had given her, and now she sat in the passenger seat of a different vehicle, Dorian's, a heavier SUV that Garrett had been driving before the bullet that had gone through his left shoulder had temporarily reassigned him to the back seat, with Cole applying pressure and a field dressing, and read the numbers off the paper while Dorian drove. He drove the way he did everything else, without apparent urgency, with complete control. She watched him from the corner of her eye and saw the tension in his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and understood that the composure was not the absence of feeling but the management of it, the way a high-pressure system managed force, not by eliminating it but by directing it into a structure that didn't break. Vasseur's people will be moving for the box, she said. Yes. How far ahead of them are we? Depends on when Gerald was supposed to check in. He took a turn without slowing, smooth and certain. If he had a scheduled contact time this morning, they know he's missed it. If the man in the suite reported back immediately, he moved fast. He wasn't covering his exit. Then we have maybe 20 minutes. He glanced at her. 1 second, no more. You're steady. I'm functional, she said. There's a difference. He looked back at the road. Yes, he said. There is. The vault facility was on a side street 2 blocks off Michigan Avenue, a narrow storefront with reinforced glass and a single entry camera, and the kind of understated signage that announced itself only to people who already knew it was there. Dorian parked on the cross street. In the back seat, Garrett said he was fine in the tone of a man who was in significant pain and had decided that acknowledging it was not currently useful. Stay, Dorian told him. You're bleeding through the dressing. Stay. He looked at Cole. With him. Cole nodded once. Dorian and Maris went in together. The interior was small and climate-controlled, with the hushed quality of spaces designed to feel permanent. A single clerk behind a desk. Male, 50s, with the professionally incurious expression of someone who had built a career on seeing nothing. Maris gave the box number, gave the code. The clerk confirmed both without comment and led them to the vault room and left them there with the box on a table and the door closed behind him. The records were paper, 43 pages of handwritten notes and printed communications, dates and instructions and names, Gerald's handwriting on the notes, the printed pages bearing no letterhead but formatted in the clinical style of operational correspondence between people who understood that what they were writing should never exist. Maris went through them with her hands flat on the table and her eyes moving fast, and Dorian stood beside her and read the same pages, and neither of them spoke for 4 minutes. The instruction chain was complete. Vasseur to Vincent by encrypted channel, Vincent to Gerald by in-person meetings documented in Gerald's notes, with dates and locations and summaries of instruction, Gerald's authorization stamp operationalized across the freight network and implementation steps recorded in his own handwriting with the compulsive thoroughness of a man building his own exculpatory evidence and his own noose simultaneously. The records also contained something neither of them had known to look for: a schedule. A timeline of the operation's final phase dated with the current week's entries marked in Gerald's handwriting as active. Maris read the current week's entry twice. "He's not leaving by commercial aviation," she said. Dorian read the entry. The final phase of Vasseur's extraction from Chicago, the point at which he would leave the city with Vincent Cray and the full operational documentation of the stolen freight network, was scheduled for departure from Raleigh Executive Airport, a private facility on the city's northwest periphery used primarily by corporate charter operations and wealthy private flyers. Departure window listed as flexible within a 6-hour range beginning at noon. Current time was 9:17 a.m., less than 3 hours. "Vincent is with him," Dorian said. Gerald's notes say the extraction was a 2-person departure: Vasseur and Vincent. The rest of Vasseur's Chicago personnel were being peeled out over the preceding 48 hours through separate channels. She looked at the page. Most of them are already gone. The people who came to the penthouse this morning were the rear guard. He was already leaving when this started. He set the board up, ensured the endgame was in motion, and the attacks on us this morning were the last operational step before departure. She straightened. He was never planning to stick around to watch it finish. Dorian was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he took the records from the table, all 43 pages, and put them inside his jacket. "We need to move," he said. They moved. Back in the SUV, Dorian made 3 calls in rapid succession, while Maris watched the streets for Vasseur's people with the particular quality of attention she had developed overnight. The constant peripheral scan, the assessment of vehicles and doorways, and the body language of figures on the sidewalk. She saw nothing that flagged, that did not comfort her. The people Vasseur used did not flag. The calls were brief and clipped. By the 3rd one, Dorian had assembled a response: 6 additional personnel, 2 vehicles, a route to Raleigh Executive that avoided the main approach roads in favor of the peripheral access used by catering and fuel contractors. He operated the logistics of it the way he operated driving, without apparent urgency, with complete control. And she listened to it happen and understood for the first time in a visceral rather than intellectual way what the word empire actually meant. Not buildings, not money, not the performance of power in boardrooms, the infrastructure of men who moved when directed, who trusted the direction without requiring its justification, who had been built over years into a system of response that could be mobilized in minutes. She thought about what it had cost him to have that system betrayed from inside. She did not say anything about it. In the back seat, Garrett had gone quiet in the way of injured people conserving resources. Cole had his phone out and was receiving information and relaying it to Dorian in fragments. The rear guard team at the penthouse had withdrawn as of 40 minutes ago, which confirmed the morning's operations were concluded from Vasseur's perspective. The Lincoln Park perimeter had dissolved. The building security desk operator who had fed position information had been identified and was no longer a variable. Maris did not ask what that last phrase meant. She was beginning to understand the vocabulary. They picked up the additional vehicles at a parking structure in River North. A handoff that took less than 3 minutes, the kind of efficiency that came from repeated practice. And then the convoy was moving northwest through the city, through neighborhoods that thinned from dense commercial to light industrial to the wide, flat periphery where Chicago loosened its grip on the land and the buildings got lower and the sky got bigger and private aviation facilities occupied their quiet acres behind chain link and runway lighting. Raleigh Executive Airport was not large. A single primary runway, 2 hangars, a small terminal building for passenger processing. The kind of facility that existed because wealthy people needed to move without the friction of commercial infrastructure and were willing to pay substantially to avoid it. They approached on this contractor road, which ran along the facility's western perimeter behind a line of maintenance buildings, and stopped the vehicles 200 meters from the nearest hangar. Through the windshield, Maris could see the hangar's open bay, a large rectangular mouth of fluorescent light against the gray morning, and inside it the shape of an aircraft being prepared for departure, ground crew moving around it, a fuel vehicle. The particular organized activity of a charter departure being readied. Dorian looked at the hangar for a long moment. 2 entry points, Cole said from the back. the vehicle bay and the personnel door on the north face. Camera coverage on both, one of the newly joined personnel said through the vehicle comm. Take the cameras down, Dorian said. 30 seconds warning before you do it. Maris was looking at the aircraft. A mid-size business jet, the kind that seated 8 to 12, with the range for transatlantic flight if it wanted. She was also looking at the ground crew, counting them, assessing their movement patterns, the way they oriented to the aircraft, whether any of them moved with the particular quality of someone who was not there to fuel a plane. 4 of those ground crew aren't ground crew, she said. Dorian looked at her. The 2 on the far side of the aircraft, they're standing in positions that give them sight lines to both entry points. The one by the fuel vehicle hasn't connected the fuel line in the 4 minutes we've been watching, and the one near the personnel door is wearing gloves that are the wrong weight for the temperature. She paused. Vasseur didn't pull his rear guard completely. He kept 4 people at the extraction point. Dorian looked at Cole. Cole looked at the hangar. She's right, he said. I know, Dorian said. He turned to Maris. Stay in the vehicle. Absolutely not. Maris, you need someone who can get inside that terminal building and pull the flight filing, she said. If Vasseur has a secondary extraction route, a different aircraft, a different runway slot filed under a shell company, it'll be in the terminal's departure system. Your people know weapons. They don't know logistics documentation. She held his gaze. I know logistics documentation. It's the only thing I've known for 4 years. Something moved in his expression. The thing under the composure, moving fast, and this time she could see it clearly enough to name it, though she didn't. The terminal's 30 meters from the hangar, he said. I know. If the 4 inside get alerted before we control the hangar, then I'll need to be faster than the alert. She looked at the terminal building. Single entrance. 1 visible camera. 30-second warning when the cameras go down. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. You run the moment you hear the first shot, he said. You don't stop. You don't look back. Terminal door, departure system, secondary filings. You have 4 minutes maximum. 4 minutes is enough. He reached across and his hand closed briefly around her wrist. Not hard, not restraining. The specific contact of a person who has run out of words for what they mean and is using the only remaining available language. And then he released it and looked forward and said to Cole, cameras in 60 seconds. 60 seconds. She counted them. At 40, she got out of the SUV and moved along the maintenance building wall toward the terminal, keeping the structure between herself and the hangar's sight lines, her shoes on the gravel making less noise than she'd feared. The morning was cold, and the wind was from the north, and she could smell aviation fuel and wet tarmac, and she focused on the terminal door and the distance to it, and the count in her head. At 0, the camera on the terminal's exterior entrance flickered and went dark. She ran. 15 meters. 10. Her hand hit the door handle and she pulled it open and she was inside, into the small, bland space of a private terminal. 4 chairs, a service counter, a single operational desk with a departure management system glowing on its screen, the room empty because the single terminal agent had apparently stepped away, which was either convenient or arranged, and she did not have time to determine which. She went directly to the departure system. Behind her, through the terminal's exterior wall, she heard the operation begin. Not gunshots yet, but the sounds immediately preceding them, the sounds of a situation crossing the threshold from preparation to execution, and she turned back to the screen and worked. The departure system was a commercial aviation management platform she had never used, but whose architecture she recognized because she had processed procurement documentation for a similar system 2 years ago when Hargrove's executive travel division had been evaluating software contracts. She found the active departure queue. 2 scheduled departures in the next 6 hours. The first was the aircraft in the hangar, filed under a charter company name she didn't recognize. Destination listed as Montreal, departure window 11:45 to 12:15. Montreal was not a destination. Montreal was a routing stop. She knew this because the weight filing for the aircraft included 2 passengers and full fuel load for a range that significantly exceeded the Montreal leg. They were refueling there for a transatlantic continuation, destination not filed because the continuation would be filed fresh at Montreal under different paperwork. The second departure was filed under a different shell name, smaller aircraft, a light twin, single pilot, filed for departure at 11:15, 30 minutes ahead of the primary. Destination, Gary Regional Airport, 12 minutes south. A 30-minute window. A shuttle to Gary. A connecting departure from Gary to somewhere else, somewhere with less scrutiny and a different paperwork trail. The first shot came through the wall as a vibration more than a sound, the building's structure absorbing and translating the impact into something felt rather than heard. Then a second. Then the unambiguous percussive sequence of a sustained engagement, the hangar becoming a different kind of space entirely. She photographed both departure filings with her phone. Then she heard the terminal door open. She turned from the screen. Vincent Cray was standing in the doorway. She had never met him. She had seen his photograph in corporate directories. The CFO of a major holding company, professionally photographed, a man of 60 with white hair and the well-maintained appearance of someone who understood that looking trustworthy was a skill worth investing in. He looked different in person. Smaller, somehow, in the way that people looked smaller when the architecture of their power was suddenly irrelevant. He was wearing a coat and carrying a bag, and he had clearly just come from the direction of the secondary aircraft and equally clearly had not expected to find anyone in the terminal. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're the assistant," he said. He said it the way people said it when they meant something else entirely. When they meant you're nobody. When they meant this isn't a problem. "I am," she said. He glanced toward the departure system screen behind her, at the photograph she'd just taken but not yet sent. "Give me the phone," he said. "No." He took a step into the room. He was 60 years old and he was not a physically threatening man. This was not a situation that would be resolved through force, and they both knew it. But he was a man who had spent 30 months running a weapons pipeline through a major corporation and had spent 14 years before that building the conditions for it. And that kind of person did not reach 60 without understanding that there were other kinds of force. "You have no idea," he said, "what you're standing in the middle of." "I have a reasonable idea," she said. "I've had all night to develop it." He studied her with the assessing qualities she'd seen in Dorian, but different. Where Dorian's assessment was about understanding, Vincent's was about calculation, about the specific arithmetic of what a person was worth and what they cost and which number was larger. "You're the one who found the partition," he said. "You left it where I could find it." She watched his face. "Gerald's clearance code. You gave it to Gerald specifically so that he would use it for routine requests and eventually hand it to an assistant for a document pull. You wanted the partition found. You wanted documentation removed from Hargrove's system before Vasseur's cleanup operation could eliminate it, because you knew Vasseur's cleanup operation would include you." Something very small changed in Vincent Cray's expression. "You needed a third party to pull those files out," she said. "Someone invisible enough not to trigger Vasseur's surveillance of the access logs immediately. Someone who would be recovered by Dorian before Vasseur's team could eliminate them, because you knew Dorian monitored threats to people in that building. You knew about his arrangements." She paused. "You were trying to create a dead man's switch, evidence of Vasseur's operation in Dorian's hands, outside your control, as insurance against Vasseur closing you out of the arrangement." Vincent Cray was very still. "It didn't work the way you planned," she said, "but you gave me those files anyway. Which means somewhere in the part of you that's been building escape routes for 30 months, you understand that the only path you have left runs through telling Dorian everything you know about Vasseur's current infrastructure." She took a step toward him. "Where is he in this building?" A long silence. The engagement in the hangar was still audible through the walls, but it had changed character. Fewer shots, longer intervals, the sound of a situation being resolved rather than escalating. Vincent looked at her phone, at the door, at the departure system screen. "The north hangar," he said. "He's been there for the last 20 minutes. He was waiting for me to confirm the primary was loaded before he boarded the secondary." He paused. "He doesn't know the primary was a decoy. He never trusted me completely. The primary was his test. If I loaded it cleanly without tipping anyone, I was still useful. If anything compromised the primary, he was already on the secondary, and I was the thing he was leaving behind. And you were going to board the secondary anyway," she said. "I was going to be on it before he arrived." Something crossed his face. Not remorse, not quite, but the exhausted realism of a man who had been running calculations for 30 years and had finally reached the end of the margin. The north hangar has a direct runway access on the east side. He has 2 men with him. Maris sent the photographs to Dorian's number with the message. North hangar, east side, 2 personnel. He's there now. Then she looked at Vincent Cray and said, "Sit down." He sat down. She stood between him and the door and listened to the hangar and watched him and waited, and the seconds moved with the particular weight of seconds in which everything that had been set in motion across 30 months and 14 years and one late night in November was converging on a single point, a single man in a second hangar waiting for a flight that was not going to come. And somewhere on the other side of the wall, Dorian Blackthorne was reading her message and already moving toward it with the particular quality of intention that she had come to understand over the last 12 hours was not cruelty and was not rage, but was the absolute finality of a man who had built an empire and watched it be used against him and had run out of patience for the distance between himself and the person responsible. The north hangar's lights were visible through the terminal's east-facing window, a yellow rectangle against the gray November sky. And she watched them and felt her heartbeat in her throat, and her hands were steady, both of them. And she held that steadiness the way you held a door against something trying to get through. And she did not look away from the light until she heard, from the direction of the north hangar, a single shot, clean and certain, and then silence. The complete and total silence of something that had been in motion for a very long time, finally arriving at its end. The silence after a single clean shot was a different kind of silence than the silence before it. Maris understood this now in a way she had not understood anything before last night. Not intellectually, not abstractly, but in the body. In the specific quality of stillness that settled into a space when the thing that had been in motion for a very long time finally stopped. She stood at the terminal's east-facing window and watched the yellow rectangle of the north hangar's light and listened to the silence resolve itself into ordinary sounds. Wind across the tarmac, the distant idle of a fuel vehicle, the structural creaking of a metal building in cold air. Vincent Cray sat in the chair behind her and did not speak. She did not turn around for a long time. When the terminal door opened, it was Cole, and behind him 2 of the men from the convoy, and behind them Dorian. He was unhurt. She registered this before she registered anything else, the way you registered the structural integrity of a building before assessing its contents. His coat was torn at the left shoulder. There was blood on his right hand that she could not tell, from the distance across the terminal, was his or someone else's. His face carried the particular settled quality of a man who had done a thing he had known for some time he would have to do, and had done it, and was now on the other side of it. He looked at Vincent. Vincent looked at him. Nothing passed between them that had words attached to it. Whatever ran between those 2 men in that moment was too old and too specific for the vocabulary available in a small terminal building on a gray November morning. 14 years of it. 14 years of proximity and trust and shared meals and confidences and the 10,000 ordinary transactions of a working relationship that had been, the entire time, a construction. Performance so sustained and so thorough that Maris found herself wondering, in the part of her mind that ran parallel to everything else, whether Vincent Cray had ever experienced a single moment of genuine feeling toward the man sitting across from him in board meetings, or whether the performance had long since consumed whatever had originally been underneath it. Dorian looked away first, not because he lost the exchange, because he was done with it. He crossed to Maris and stood beside her at the window and looked at the north hangar and then looked at her and said quietly, "Are you all right?" "Yes." He looked at her hands. They were steady. He looked at her face. "You sent the message in time," he said. "The secondary filing," she said. "Gary Regional." He had a shuttle planned, light twin, pilot only, connecting to a longer departure from Gary. Vasseur was never boarding the primary aircraft. That was the test for Vincent. "I know, we found the secondary aircraft." A pause. The pilot had already been briefed on the route. He was cooperative once it became clear cooperation was the more viable option. Where was Vasseur going? Amsterdam. From Gary to a private strip in Quebec, then transatlantic to Amsterdam, where his financial infrastructure is housed. He was quiet for a moment. He had been building toward Amsterdam for 2 years. Every significant asset, every account, every operational relationship that mattered to him was already there. He was always going to leave. Chicago was never permanent to him. It was an acquisition target. Dorian looked at the north hangar. He wanted the freight infrastructure, the port contacts, the routing network, With those, he could replicate in Amsterdam what he had built in Detroit, with access to European distribution channels that Detroit couldn't provide. He paused. He didn't want my territory. He wanted my methodology. She thought about that, about the particular kind of ambition that looked at a thing someone else had built across decades of sacrifice and patience, and said, "I'll take the blueprint and skip the decades." "Vincent," she said, "what happens to him?" Dorian was quiet for long enough that she looked at him directly. "He'll talk," Dorian said. "He'll give us everything, every contact he established for Vasseur, every arrangement he brokered, every name in the network that the partition files didn't capture. He has no remaining alternative." A pause. After that, he didn't finish the sentence. She didn't ask him to. She looked at Cole and the other men, and at Vincent still sitting in the chair with the bag at his feet, and the expression of a man who had reached the end of a very long road and found it terminated somewhere he had not planned for. "Gerald's records," she said. "They document the instruction chain completely. Vasseur to Vincent to Gerald. Gerald's stamp on the invoices is exculpatory for anyone who reads the context correctly. He was directed, not autonomous. He was building insurance, not running the operation." She paused. "He's in a hospital now, presumably." "He's alive," Cole said from across the room. "Critical but stable. The responders got there in time." She registered this information and put it in the appropriate place and moved on. "The records need to go somewhere that isn't just your organization," she said to Dorian. "I understand why you would want to manage this internally, but the weapons network ran through a publicly traded corporation's freight infrastructure for 30 months. There are downstream consequences, carriers, port operators, receiving entities, that extend beyond your organization's ability to contain without institutional involvement." She held his gaze. "And there are people in regulatory and enforcement positions in this city who are not compromised, who would want to know what those records contain." He looked at her. "You're telling me to share evidence with law enforcement," he said. "I'm telling you that the evidence, handled correctly, dismantles Vasseur's Chicago infrastructure permanently and documents the freight network's misuse in a way that protects Hargrove's legitimate operations from liability exposure." She paused. "It also creates a public record of what Vasseur attempted, which makes it significantly harder for anyone to attempt it again, against you or anyone else." A long silence. "You've been thinking about this since the terminal," he said. "I've been thinking about it since 2 a.m., she said. "When Rena showed me the subsidiary account structure and I realized the scale of the exposure." Something shifted in his expression, the compressed thing under the composure, moving again, and this time it broke the surface fractionally. And what it was, she could see clearly now in the flat November light of the terminal, was not softness exactly, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as it. The thing a man felt when someone saw the full weight of what he was carrying and did not step back from it. "There's a federal financial crimes investigator," he said finally. "I've had a working relationship with her office for 3 years. Arm's length, careful, mutually beneficial. She has jurisdiction over the freight network exposure, and she's not connected to the structures Vasseur had access to." He paused. "If I bring her Gerald's records and the partition files, she'll pursue the network, not you," Maris said. "The records show Vasseur's operation, not yours. Your organization appears in those documents as the infrastructure that was compromised, not the entity that built the pipeline. That distinction is more complex than it appears in the documentation." "I know, which is why you need someone who can read logistics documentation and explain the operational architecture to a federal investigator in terms that accurately represent the distinction." She held his gaze. "That's also something I can do." He was quiet. "You're proposing to walk into a federal investigator's office with me," he said. "I'm proposing to walk into a federal investigator's office instead of spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder because I pulled a drive from a partition I was technically authorized to access." She paused. "It's the cleaner solution." He almost smiled. She had the sense it was something he did rarely and with effort, not because he was a humorless man, but because somewhere in the decades of managing what he managed, levity had become a luxury with insufficient return on investment. "All right," he said. They left the terminal. Cole managed Vincent. The convoy reorganized with the efficient brevity of people who had done this kind of reorganization before. Garrett, in the back seat, had been given a proper field dressing by one of the additional personnel who turned out to have medical training, and his color was better. And when Maris got into the vehicle and asked him how he was, He said fine in a tone that this time was closer to accurate. On the drive back into the city, the morning light was fully established. The flat gray of a Chicago November working day, the kind of light that didn't flatter anything and didn't try to. She watched the city come back into density as they moved from the periphery toward the center, the buildings rising, the streets filling with the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday. And she thought about the office tower on the near north side with its 42 floors of black glass and the marble lobby, and the workstation on the 31st floor where her coffee cup was still sitting from the evening before, cold and forgotten. She thought about what it meant that she was not going back to that workstation, not because she couldn't, because the person who had sat at it for 4 years, the invisible assistant with the careful face and the held-back hair and the capacity to process thousands of pages of logistics documentation without anyone understanding that she was actually reading them. That person had been the shell of something that hadn't known yet what it was. And the last 14 hours had been the process of finding out. She was not sure she was grateful for the process. She was fairly sure gratitude was not the right category for it. Dorian's phone had been ringing intermittently since they left the airport. He answered selectively, speaking in the clipped operational shorthand she was becoming accustomed to, delegating with the economy of a man who had long since learned that delegation worked best when it was trusted completely or not at all. Between calls, he was silent. She did not fill the silence. She had spent 4 years in proximity to people who used silence as a staging ground for performance, who were quiet only when they were calculating how to appear. And Dorian's silence was different. It was inhabited. There was someone actually in it. The federal investigator's office was in the Dirksen Federal Building on Dearborn Street, and Dorian made a call ahead that she was not fully privy to, speaking quietly to someone he clearly knew well enough to reach on a direct line without a scheduled appointment on a Tuesday morning. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he said they would be received in 40 minutes. They stopped at the penthouse first. She washed her face and changed into clothes Rena had procured from somewhere. Dark slacks, a black sweater, a gray coat that fit well enough. And she stood in the bathroom of the room she'd slept in and looked at her reflection with the specific attention of someone she hadn't seen in a while. The face looking back was not particularly different from the face she'd looked at yesterday morning. Slightly paler. The eyes carrying something that hadn't been there before, a quality she couldn't name exactly. Not hardness, not age, something more like resolution. The look of a person who had been tested against an unknown standard and had discovered, in the testing, what the standard was. She pulled her hair back. She went out. Rena was at her station. The equipment table had been partially cleared. The screen showed status updates she did not try to read. Rena looked at her, and there was something in the look that had not been there at 6 a.m. A quality of recognition between two people who have survived a shared thing and are now in the slightly awkward space of acknowledging it without a script for how to do that. The interlayer decryption finished, Rena said. 2 hours ago. I've been going through the contact ledger. How extensive? 37 names across 9 cities. Port-level contacts in 4 facilities. 3 receiving entities that I can identify as existing operations running under legitimate business covers. She paused. It's a complete network. Everything Vasseur needed to replicate your freight operation in Europe. That goes to the federal investigator this morning, Maris said. Rena looked past her at Dorian, who had come out of his room and was buttoning his jacket with the composed deliberateness she was now accustomed to. Dorian nodded once. Rena pulled the files onto a secured drive without further discussion. In the elevator going down, Dorian stood beside her again in the confined space, and she felt the same thing she'd felt on the way up the previous night. The particular weight of his presence, the quality of stillness in him, the way the space reorganized itself around whoever he was. And she thought about what Rena had said at 4 a.m. He's been paying attention to you for considerably longer than tonight. She had not had time to examine that then. She had time now, or something adjacent to time, the 40-second duration of an elevator descent. The arrangements you had in place, she said, for protection. Before last night. He looked at her. Rena told you. She confirmed what you said in the car, that you had arrangements regarding my situation. She kept her voice even. Financial. The harassment situation at my previous employer, the stalker in 2022. He was quiet. I need to understand what that was, she said. It was what it was, he said. That's not an answer. No, he said. It isn't. The elevator continued its descent. I noticed you in your first month at Hargrove. Not in the way you might assume. Not a personal fixation. I was reviewing a risk assessment of the executive floor's administrative staff as part of a standard security audit, and your file came across my desk, and I read it the way I read everything, which is completely. He paused. Your previous employer had created a hostile work environment that included 3 documented instances of harassment that HR had buried. The financial exposure from a previous tenant dispute had damaged your credit in ways that were not your fault. The individual who was following you in 2022 had a prior restraining order violation in another state that the local police department had not accessed when they reviewed his file. He paused again. I had resources that made those situations addressable. I addressed them without telling me. Yes. Why? He looked at the elevator doors. Because telling you would have changed what you were to me. She absorbed this. What was I to you? She said. The elevator opened into the lobby. He stepped out and looked back at her, and his pale gray eyes held something that the cameras had always failed to capture and that she was finally close enough in sufficient light to read accurately. The most capable person in any room you walked into, he said, who had no idea that was true, and who I could not, in good conscience, compromise by making you aware of my interest until the circumstances had changed sufficiently that the awareness would be a choice rather than a complication. She stood in the elevator for one more second, then she stepped out. They walked out of the building into the Chicago morning, cold, gray, purposeful, and the wind came off the lake to the east and hit them both with its flat November indifference, and she turned her collar up, and he signaled to Cole, who brought the vehicle around, and they got in, and the city moved past the windows toward the federal building on Dearborn. The meeting with the investigator lasted 3 hours. Her name was Patricia Voss, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, with the measured quality of someone who had built a career on the accurate assessment of what people were not saying. She sat across a conference table from Dorian and Maris, and she listened with the specific intensity of someone who understood, within the first 10 minutes, that what she was being given was not a routine cooperation package, but a fully documented dismantling of an interstate weapons distribution network with an evidentiary trail solid enough to pursue without risk of procedural failure. Maris walked her through the partition files, the subsidiary account structure, Gerald's hard copy records, the interlayer contact ledger. She did it in the language of logistics documentation, the routing anomalies, the weight configuration discrepancies, the ghost carrier architecture, translating the operational machinery into the terms of evidence with the methodical precision she had applied to every document that had ever crossed her desk. And she watched Patricia Voss's expression move from careful attention to something considerably more alert. Dorian answered the questions about organizational structure, about his relationship to the freight network's legitimate operations, about the timeline of his awareness of the penetration. He answered without evasion and without complete disclosure, threading the needle with the practiced facility of a man who had spent decades operating at the intersection of power and law. And Patricia Voss, who was not unsophisticated, received his answers with the expression of someone who understood exactly where the needle was being threaded and had decided, for reasons of her own, that the evidentiary value of what she was receiving justified the threading. When it was over, she shook both their hands and looked at Maris for a moment longer than was strictly required and said, "The documentation methodology on the routing analysis, that's yours?" "Yes," Maris said. "That's very good work." Maris did not say thank you. She said, "I know." They came out of the federal building into the afternoon. It was past 3 o'clock. The light was already thinning toward the early dark of late autumn, the city beginning its transition to the artificial illumination it ran on for a significant portion of the year. She stood on the Dearborn Street sidewalk and breathed cold air and felt the day's accumulated weight settle into her shoulders and her back and the muscles of her legs with the comprehensive thoroughness of exhaustion that had been deferred for too long. Dorian stood beside her. "It's done," he said. "The federal side is started," she said. "Done is a longer process." "Yes." He looked at the street. "Hargrove's board will need to be addressed. The legitimate freight operations will need a structural review to ensure the ghost carrier contamination is completely excised. The 37 names in the contact ledger will generate federal investigations in multiple cities that will run for months." He paused. and Vincent will need to be managed through a deposition process that requires— Dorian, she said. He stopped. Is any of that happening today? She said. A pause. No, he said. Then it can wait until tomorrow. She looked at the street. A taxi went past. A woman walked by with a dog. Two men in suits argued about something on the corner with the focused passion of people for whom the argument was a substitute for a different conversation. The city did what it always did: moved, breathed, generated its continuous low-grade roar of existence. And she stood inside it and felt for the first time since 9:30 p.m. the previous night something that was not the absence of threat so much as the presence of something else. The sense of having arrived at a place rather than fleeing from one. I need to feed my cat, she said. Something crossed his face that was, she was now certain, the suppressed architecture of a smile. I'll have someone go to your apartment, he said. The cat doesn't like strangers. I'll go with them. She looked at him, the pale gray eyes, the composure and what lived underneath it, which was not cold and was not calculated and was, she understood now with the clarity of someone who had spent 24 hours watching a man operate under the kind of pressure that stripped everything superficial away, simply the way he had learned to carry the weight of what he was. All right, she said. They walked to the vehicle. In the weeks that followed, the things that needed to happen happened with the grinding, unglamorous thoroughness of institutional process. Patricia Voss's office moved against the carrier network. 3 of the 37 names were arrested within the first 10 days. The port contacts in 2 facilities were suspended pending federal review. The ghost carrier infrastructure was formally dissolved through a series of corporate filings that Maris drafted and reviewed with a precision that the federal investigators found, on more than one occasion, remarkable. Gerald Thorne survived. He spent 11 days in intensive care and emerged into a situation that was legally complex and personally ruinous in ways that would occupy attorneys for the better part of 2 years. Maris read his statement when it became available and recognized in it the careful, organized mind of a man who had always understood documentation and had, in the end, documented his own downfall with the same thoroughness he'd brought to everything else. Vincent Cray was cooperative in the way that people were cooperative when the alternative had become structurally untenable. He gave names and dates and operational details across 6 deposition sessions, and what he gave was accurate. Maris cross-referenced it against the partition files herself. And when it was done, he was a man who had given everything he had and had nothing remaining that was worth protecting. She did not feel sorry for him. She did not feel the absence of sorry for him. She felt, when she thought about him, which was less and less often as the weeks turned, the particular neutral weight of a fact that has been fully processed and filed and no longer requires active attention. Hargrove Meridian's legitimate freight operations underwent structural review. The board convened an emergency session, and guided by documentation that Maris prepared with the methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, determined that the corporation's core operations were sound and the contamination was surgical rather than systemic. 3 board members who had been aware of irregularities and had chosen in curiosity over inquiry resigned. 2 were replaced by people whose primary qualification was a demonstrated appetite for accurate information. Maris's official title changed. She was not given a new title immediately. This was deliberate. Hers and Dorian's mutual understanding that the work she was doing for his organization, which was different from anything that existed in a standard corporate org chart, required a period of practical definition before it could be formally named. She spent those weeks learning the architecture of what he had built, not the criminal infrastructure, which was being systematically restructured in the aftermath of the Vassar operation, but the legitimate empire that surrounded and sustained it. With the same focused attention she had brought to the partition files on the night of November 12th. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference was that now there was no one who did not know it. Rena, after the first 2 weeks, stopped explaining context when she briefed Maris on operational matters. The 2 of them developed a working rhythm that was spare and efficient, and occasionally, when the work permitted it, laced with the dry humor of people who shared an accurate assessment of how absurd most of what they were dealing with actually was. Garrett healed. His shoulder required physical therapy, and he undertook it with the stoic grudgingness of a man who considered physical limitation a personal affront. Cole said nothing about this, which was consistent with Cole's approach to most things. On a Tuesday evening in December, 6 weeks after the night she had run down a stairwell in a black glass tower, Maris sat in the penthouse at the equipment table with a glass of wine she had poured herself from a bottle that had been opened and left on the counter, and she looked at the lake through the wall of windows. The water was dark, and the city's reflection moved across its surface in shifting, broken patterns, and the wind she could not hear from inside pressed against the glass with its flat, impersonal persistence. Dorian came in from the office at the far end of the floor and stood in the entrance of the main room and looked at her. She looked back. He crossed the room and poured himself a glass and sat in the chair across from hers. And the city did what the city did beyond the glass, and they were quiet for a while in the inhabited way of two people who had learned each other's silences well enough to be inside them comfortably. "Voss called today," he said. "I know. She called me also. The Quebec Strips operation is being wound down. They've traced 4 of the Amsterdam accounts." He paused. "It'll be 8 more months before the network is fully documented." "Probably 10, she said. "The Rotterdam connection is more complex than the initial filings suggested." He looked at her. "You've been working the Rotterdam connection. I read the secondary filings last week. The shell structure has 3 layers that the federal team hasn't unpacked yet. I wrote a routing analysis." She picked up her wine. "I left it on your desk." He was quiet for a moment. "Maris?" he said. She looked at him. "What you did," he said, "from the moment you found the partition, everything you chose, the drive, the roof, Gerald's records, the terminal." He paused, and she could see him choosing words with the care of a man for whom language had always been a tool rather than an expression, and who was attempting, with visible effort, to use it differently. "I have built this organization across 20 years, and I have worked with capable people across all of those years. I have not worked with anyone who saw what you saw, as fast as you saw it, and acted on it without the paralysis that most people experience when the stakes become real." She looked at her wine. "I was terrified," she said. "I know. I wasn't functional because I wasn't afraid. I was functional because being paralyzed was a worse option than moving." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." She looked at him across the low table between their chairs, the pale gray eyes that cameras had always rendered incorrectly, and that she had now had sufficient proximity to read accurately, which was not coldness and was not calculation, and was the complex specific thing of a man who had learned, across a long time and through a significant cost, not to want things he could not protect. He had protected her before she knew she needed it. He was looking at her now with the expression of someone who had decided, or was deciding, that the circumstances had changed sufficiently that the awareness was a choice rather than a complication. She thought about invisible people, about what they heard, about what they saw, about the 4 years she had spent in a building full of people who had looked through her and how that had felt, and also about what it had given her. The maps, the exits, the architecture of every room she had ever been in, the capacity to move through a crisis with steady hands and a mind that sharpened under pressure because it had spent years sharpening on things too small for anyone else to notice. She had been overlooked her entire career. She was not overlooked now. She reached across the table and picked up his glass and handed it to him because he had set it down and forgotten it, which was a thing he did when he was thinking. And he took it from her hand, and their fingers touched in the transaction, and neither of them moved away from the contact. Outside the lake moved in the dark, enormous and indifferent, running its old cold miles toward the horizon with the permanence of things that had been there before the city and would be there after it. The lights burned across the skyline, 10,000 points of will against the dark. The wind pressed against the glass and did not get in. Inside, 2 people who had found each other at the end of a night that could have ended entirely differently sat in the quiet of what they had survived and what they had built from it. And the city below them belonged to both of them now. Its light, its weight, its capacity for danger, and for something that was not exactly peace but was the closest thing available to people like them. Which was, she had come to understand, enough. More than enough. It was the beginning of an entirely different kind of life.